Okay, so let's dive in. Have you ever, stopped and wondered how interconnected ancient cultures really were? Or maybe how the stories we tell about history actually get made? Today, we're plunging into a really major academic dust-up, one that truly shook the world of classical studies. Martin Bernal's Black Athena. And this isn't just, dry history. It's more like a look behind the scenes at how history gets written, how it gets challenged, and sometimes how fiercely it gets defended. We're talking about conflicting theories, some pretty surprising ideas about language links, and maybe even the human biases that, well, shape how we see the past.
Exactly. And what's so compelling here is how this one scholar with this multi-volume work basically lit a fire under decades, even centuries, of assumptions about where Western civilization actually came from. It's a great story about how knowledge isn't fixed, how we're constantly reevaluating what we think we know for sure.
Right. So our mission today is to explore what Bernal was actually arguing, understand the pretty intense backlash he faced, and see what this whole deep dive tells us about how academia works, about cultural borrowing, and why history is never really truly settled. You might find yourself looking at some foundational stories a bit differently by the end. Okay, so let's start with the man himself. Who was Martin Bernal, and what was this big idea that caused such a stir in classics?
Well, interestingly, Bernal wasn't actually trained as a classicist. That's key. He was born in London, 1937, studied Chinese history, Chinese language, prestigious places like King's College London, Peking University, Cambridge. His PhD was actually on Chinese socialism. He ended up as a professor at Cornell, but in government and New Eastern studies.
So an outsider's perspective, really.
Totally. And that's crucial, like you said. It meant he came to ancient Greece without maybe the same ingrained assumptions a career classicist might have. He looked at the evidence, or what he saw as evidence, with, let's say, fresh eyes. And what he proposed fundamentally challenged the story everyone knew.
And what was that story? He basically said, the standard narrative about ancient Greece, the one most of us learned, was missing huge chunks, right? Almost presenting Greece like it popped up out of nowhere.
Pretty much. In Black Athena, he sets up this contrast between two models. He called them the ancient model and the Aryan model. The ancient model, he argued, was actually the common view up until maybe the mid-18th century. And this model suggested that civilizations from Egypt and the Levant, so North Africa and the Near East, had a really significant shaping influence on early Greek culture. I mean, even early Greek writers themselves, like Herodotus, talked about foreigners, Phoenicians, Egyptians influencing Greece, even founding cities or bringing over religious ideas. That wasn't seen as weird back then.
Right, so the ancient model saw Greece as part of this wider Mediterranean world, absorbing influences. But then came the Aryan model. That's the one that sounds more familiar, the sort of Greek miracle idea.
That's the one. Bernal traces its rise from the late 18th century. And this model, he argued, really centered Greece as the sole pure origin point for Western civilization. He linked its rise to, well, some pretty uncomfortable things: the growth of European racism, romantic nationalism, this intense focus in the 19th century on categorizing people, races. And as part of that, scholars across different fields, history, linguistics, even early anthropology and biology started, Bernal claimed, to systematically downplay or outright reject any significant non-European, especially Egyptian or Semitic influence on Greece.
So it wasn't just an academic shift in his view, but tied to broader ideologies.
Yes, he saw it as an ideological project almost, to create this pure, independent European origin story, cutting off those earlier connections that the ancient model accepted.
Can you give an example of how this Aryan model pushed back against older ideas?
Sure. Bernal talks about a French professor, Charles-François Dupuis, late 18th century. Dupuis argued that things like Christianity were really just blends of older mythologies, and he also challenged the idea of a purely Greek start to Western thought. According to Bernal, Dupuis wasn't just debated. His ideas were basically dismissed as ridiculous by Christian commentators and these emerging proponents of the Aryan model.
Why? Because they didn't fit the new narrative.
Exactly. They didn't fit the story of Greek uniqueness, of Greece as the singular pure source. It shows how powerful narratives can sometimes just sideline inconvenient ideas rather than engage with them directly.
Okay, so Bernal drops this historical bombshell, rereading the origins of Greece and accusing the established model of having racist roots. You can imagine the reaction.
Oh, yeah. Intense is putting it mildly. The response from the classics establishment was fast and often furious. Probably the most famous counterattack came from Mary Lefkowitz, a respected classics professor at Wellesley College.
Right, not out of Africa.
That's the one. She initially wrote a piece challenging him, and then later edited this big collection of essays, about 500 pages, specifically taking apart Bernal's arguments. It became sort of the flagship rebuttal.
So what was her core issue? Was it just about factual errors, or was there something deeper bothering her and other classicists?
Well, she definitely pointed out what she saw as errors, misinterpretations, selective use of evidence in Bernal's work. That was part of it. But her deeper concern, reading her work, seems to be how his ideas were being picked up and used, particularly by what she described as a self-proclaimed Afrocentrist circle.
Okay, how so?
She argued they were using Black Athena to claim essentially that the Greeks stole everything from Africa and that classicists had been part of this long conspiracy to hide that theft and denigrate African people.
Wow.
Yeah. So for Lefkowitz, it moved beyond academic disagreement into something that felt like an attack on her field and personally charged.
That does sound like it goes way beyond just debating historical facts. It's touching on identity, politics, historical grievances.
Absolutely. You get the sense that many classicists felt personally attacked. They felt accused as a group of being racist simply for upholding the traditional view of Greek history. Lefkowitz herself, she'd focused her own work on giving voice to marginalized groups in the ancient world, like women. So for her to be accused of racism, you can see how that would feel particularly unjust and painful.
It really highlights how these academic debates aren't always just about the past, are they? They can become proxies for present-day conflicts and identities.
Definitely. And it raises that difficult question. How do you separate the historical investigation from the very real, very human emotions and political context surrounding it?
Things got even uglier, didn't they, with accusations flying that went beyond academic criticism.
Yes, sadly. There was this incident Lefkowitz describes where she challenged another scholar, Yosef Ben-Jochannan, at a lecture. His response, according to her account, was to accuse her of being part of a Jewish onslaught attacking Black people.
Oh, wow. Bringing in anti-Semitic tropes.
Exactly. It's a really stark example of how quickly these things can spiral downwards, away from scholarly debate and into deeply harmful territory, invoking conspiracy theories and playing on sensitive societal divisions.
It's like getting a glimpse behind the polite facade of academia sometimes. It reminds you that historians are people living in their own time, with their own backgrounds, and, yes, maybe biases.
That's such a crucial point. It's not just about the evidence itself, but about who is looking at the evidence and what lens they're using. Our own beliefs, our politics, they shape how we piece together the past. Bernal himself pushed back on this, didn't he? He basically said, look, I didn't introduce politics here. Politics, specifically racist ideology, was baked into classics from its formation in the 19th century.
Right, he was claiming to expose existing biases, not inject new ones.
That was his argument. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, it forces a conversation about the history of the field itself.
Okay, let's pivot from the controversy itself and get into the actual evidence Bernal used.
Yeah.
He didn't just rely on reinterpreting old texts, right? Language was a big part of his case.
A huge part. For Bernal, it was almost common sense.
Yeah.
If you have intensive long-term contact between cultures like Egypt, the Levant, and the Aegean, especially with power imbalances, you must see that reflected in the languages. He made the pretty radical claim that maybe over half the Greek vocabulary wasn't originally Indo-European, but came from ancient Egyptian or West Semitic languages.
Over half. That's massive.
It is. Even if the basic grammar stayed Indo-European, that level of borrowing would indicate incredibly deep influence.
Can you give us a few examples? What kind of word connections did he propose?
He offered hundreds, but some interesting ones include the Greek word anthos, meaning flower, blossom, growth. He linked it to an Egyptian root connected to the generative power that makes things bloom periodically, noting the huge religious importance of flowers in Egypt. So a shared concept. Or Basilius, the Greek word for a king or high official. He connected it to an Egyptian word, pierre, vocalized something like passiara in the late Bronze Age, meaning the official. Similar sound, similar function in society.
That one sounds quite direct.
It does. Another is kilioi, Greek for thousand. He links it to the Egyptian ang, also thousand. Basic numbers, strong semantic match, and even abstract concepts like honor, value, compensation in Greek. He suggested a connection to an Egyptian term meaning something like to render true, to justify, to praise.
So how did the linguists react to this? The specialists in Indo-European languages, I imagine this didn't sit well with traditional etymologies.
No, it did not sit well at all. Many leading Indo-European linguists, figures like J. Jasanoff, Michael Nussbaum, were highly critical. They were often seen as defending what's called the neo-grammarian tradition. That approach emphasizes very strict, regular sound laws for how languages change internally.
Right, the idea that sound changes are predictable and exceptionless, more or less.
Exactly. And that tradition tends to be skeptical of massive borrowing, especially from languages considered structurally different or from, let's say, cultures not seen as dynamic in the traditional narrative. They argued Bernal's proposed etymologies often ignored established sound laws, lacked regular patterns, or were just chance similarities. They saw loan words as usually more obvious and limited.
But Bernal's counter was that languages aren't these pure systems developing in isolation, right? They're used by actual people interacting.
Precisely. He kept hammering that point. Languages are not autonomous entities, but social creations. Social contact means linguistic contact. It's unavoidable. He'd point to examples like Japanese borrowing huge amounts of vocabulary from Chinese, even though the languages are unrelated, just because of centuries of close cultural contact and influence. Why couldn't that happen with Greek?
It's a compelling analogy. So beyond the language, what about other evidence? Archaeology, historical traditions.
Yes, he brought those in too. He argued for many different Egyptian and Levantine interventions in and influences on the Aegean during the Bronze Age. He pointed to things like geographical closeness, the clear power and cultural sophistication of Egypt at the time compared to the early Aegean world.
Makes sense.
And specific finds, like those Minoan-style frescoes found in Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos rulers in Egypt. That clearly shows Aegean artists or styles present in Egypt.
All right, tangible links.
And he kept coming back to those early Greek writers like Herodotus. Why, he asked, would Greeks invent stories about being colonized or civilized by Egyptians and Phoenicians, especially later when they developed strong prejudices against barbarians? He argued those traditions must have been very strong and based on some real historical memory to survive.
So if you put the linguistic claims, the archaeology, these traditions together, it paints a picture that really undermines that Greek miracle idea of isolation.
That was exactly his goal, to show a deeply interconnected ancient Mediterranean where Greece was a recipient of influences, not just a source.
Which brings us back to the bigger picture. This whole deep dive, it's fascinating ancient history. But why does it matter now? What's the takeaway for us listening today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that history isn't this fixed thing we just uncover. It's constantly being reinterpreted. We're always putting the puzzle pieces together in different ways, right? Trying to shed new light, understand the human experience better, and even controversial work that maybe gets details wrong, like some argue Bernal did, can be incredibly valuable because it pushes the conversation forward. It forces people to re-examine things they took for granted.
So the value of Black Athena might not just be in whether every single claim was right, but in the questions it forced the field to confront about its own assumptions, its own history.
Absolutely. It definitely shone a spotlight on how scholars themselves can sometimes unconsciously normalize identity categories or reflect the biases of their own time. It pushed classics to think harder about race, culture, diversity in the ancient world, and to look critically at the context of earlier scholars, not just treat them as infallible authorities.
And that Greek miracle idea wasn't just an innocent historical theory, was it? You mentioned it had real-world implications.
Yeah, the narrative of Greece springing up ex nihilo, creating democracy, philosophy, art, all on its own, that story has been incredibly powerful in positioning Europe as the sole inheritor of these greatest hits of civilization. It's been used, consciously or not, to bolster European identity and even justify power structures. So challenging that narrative, like Bernal did, means challenging some deeply embedded ideas about cultural ownership and superiority.
It really makes you scrutinize those origin stories we all learn. Where do they come from? Who benefits from them?
Exactly. It's a powerful lesson in historical critique.
So it feels like the ultimate message is that history is always a conversation, an evolving dialogue between the past and the present, not a finished book.
Beautifully put. And by broadening our view, looking beyond just Europe to see the connections with Southwest Asia, with Egypt, we get a much richer, frankly more accurate picture of how Greek culture actually developed. It teaches us that scholarship needs that dynamism. We shouldn't aim for the final, definitive answer, maybe, but embrace the ability to ask more questions and illuminate some of them. Keep the inquiry alive.
This whole Black Athena saga, then, is a really potent reminder, isn't it? The past is always up for debate. New evidence, new viewpoints, even our own changing world. It all shapes how we see what came before.
And connecting it out, it really encourages all of us, you included, to just question the narratives we inherit. About ancient Greece, sure, but about anything, really. Think about those hidden connections between cultures, the very human arguments behind academic theories, how identity always seems to play a role.
So what's the one thing that sticks with you from this deep dive? Maybe it's that idea of linguistic purity being, well, probably a myth in a place like the ancient Mediterranean, all that mixing.
Or maybe how our heroes, our foundational figures, always seem to become reflections of what we need them to be in the present moment.
Yeah. So the next time you hear a historical fact, maybe pause and think about the journey that idea took. Who told that story first? Whose perspective might be missing? It's rarely simple,